Welcome to part 2 of my series about surge. Today I'm talking about the oscillators, and I have to warn you not only that there is a ton of oscillator variants, but there are also tons of different parameters to discover. Each of the 11 groups of oscillators come with their own set of parameters and functions. Functions which are partly hiding in diverse submenus. So, go and make yourself a huge pot of coffee and be prepared to spend the rest of the night with this video. Let's go then. The oscillator section houses 3 independent oscillators, each of which has its own channel in the mixer. I mute all channels, but for channel 1 in the mixer to make things easier to understand and to hear. Now only the first of the 3 oscillators is audible. With each of the 3 oscillators we can choose between 11, let me call it groups or kinds of oscillators. The correct term is algorithms, by the way. And there's an external audio input as well, which has, like the algorithms classic and modern, a self-explanatory submenu. So far things look quite easy. Things start getting more interesting when we get aware of the different sets of parameters. Some of these sets show even subsets, which are offered in diverse windows. And things get really amazing when we have a deeper look at the algorithm's wavetable and window and discover how many different wavetables the synth has on offer, organized in menus, submenus, and sub-submenus. As I'm going to demonstrate and explain the specific characteristics of each algorithm, each group of oscillators, I won't talk about the difference between wavetable and window oscillators right now. So, how am I going to proceed in this video? Well, I'll show and explain the characteristics of the 11 algorithms from classic to sample and hold noise, and I'm going to demonstrate and explain each single parameter in the parameter set of these 11 algorithms. If there's a window to choose subparameters, I'll show and explain even these. With the wavetable algorithm, I demonstrate and talk about the specifics and best applications of each of the groups of wavetables, and go even a bit deeper with certain individual wavetables, making complete setups of instruments and voices, and doing a bit of, let's say, more professional sound design. It may well be that I'll have to cut this video into smaller parts, which I'll publish consecutively then. Let's start with the algorithm called Classic now. The first 4 parameters are the same with all kinds, groups, algorithms of oscillators. Key track should be lit if you want the pitch of the sound to follow the key you press on your keyboard. When key track is unlit, the oscillator will play the same pitch regardless of which key is pressed. If retrigger is active, the oscillator and all its unison voices will start at the same phase position, which is good for, let's say, more snappy sounds. Well, the octave buttons and the pitch slider are self-explanatory. The number of unison voices and how much they are detuned against each other are characteristics we set with the 2 sliders at the bottom. And even here, further explanations aren't necessary. I We can get up to 16 unison voices of the same oscillator, and the detuning reaches up to quite chaotic sounds. To understand the functions of the rest of the parameters, we have to know the following. The classic algorithm contains of a main oscillator that can generate a pulse wave, a sawtooth wave, and a dual saw wave, and can smoothly morph between all these. The responsible parameter or slider is called shape. When the shape slider is in its middle position, the main oscillator produces a saw wave, and the slider called width 1 doesn't have any influence on the sound. But this changes dramatically when we walk either in the direction of a dual saw or in the opposite direction to a pulse wave. With shape slider positions to the right, the two saw waves undergo a phase shift against each other when I move the width slider, the width 1 slider. And with shape slider positions to the left, the width 1 slider sets the duty cycle of the pulse wave. It's similar with the width 2 parameter. As long as the shape slider is in middle position and the main oscillator generates a simple sawtooth wave, the width 2 parameter doesn't have any influence. But at once, when moving the shape to either side, the width 2 parameter squeezes or expands the waveform. But there isn't only a main oscillator, but also a sub-oscillator. Here the sub-mix slider steps in. With its leftmost position we hear only the main oscillator. This is the situation we have always had so far. But moving the slider up to the right, we get more and more of the sub-oscillator and less of the main oscillator, until in the rightmost position of the sub-mix slider we hear only the sub-oscillator. The sub-oscillator provides a pulse wave 1 octave below the main oscillator. Changing the pulse width of the sub-oscillator using the width 2 slider affects the main oscillator as well. The sub-oscillator serves as the bass pitch generator when I activate the oscillator self-sync using the sync slider. The second offer in the classic menu, the square, is different from the sawtooth option, the one we have had so far, only in its, well, let me say, starting point. It's the same algorithm, the same principles are valid, only that the shape slider starts at its leftmost position when calling this wave shape. Some words about the right-click menus now. These menus contain functions of the DAW as well as specific functions of the parameter which I have right-clicked. The upper part of the menu contains functions offered by the VST search and concern specific values of the parameter which I have right-clicked, whereas the lower part of the menu is offered by the DAW. Here it is FL Studio. In the picture we see, just an example, the right-click menus of the parameters unison voices on the left and with one right on the right screenshot. The parameter specifics let us set values manually by typing them in instead of moving the slider or knob. Further, there we can determine the modulation source, if it is possible to modulate the clicked parameter, of course. Further, we can assign the slider or knob to MIDI CC, and we can activate the MIDI learn function. Activating the MIDI learn function can also be done directly in the DAW with most of the DAWs that I know. The function at modulation source means sources which are part of the VST search itself. It doesn't refer to modulation sources outside of search. The latter are a matter of the signal routing in your DAW. I'm going to talk about modulation in search in a later video in this series. The next algorithm is called modern. In its submenu we find sawtooth and square again. So what's the difference to the classic algorithm I've been talking about so far? Well, the waves are cleaner. But the sound is not that different though. Let me compare the shape and the spectrum of a sawtooth wave from the classic algorithm and a sawtooth wave from the modern algorithm. I freeze the signal analyzer to look at the differences. We see that the sawtooth from the classic department is down ramp, whereas the modern algorithm produces an up ramp. And the spectrum of the modern sawtooth reaches a tiny bit further up the frequency range than that of the classic sawtooth. Let me compare the square waves of both algorithms now. The shape of the waves show the differences a lot clearer than the spectrum this time. But when we measure the amplitudes in both spectra, we also discover that the reduction of the amplitudes from partial to partial is a bit more regular in the modern variant of the wave, a bit nearer to the theoretical frequency development of an ideal square wave. But what is this algorithm called modern after all? Well, a look at the set of parameters gives us the right clues. This algorithm creates a pulse or square wave, a triangle wave, a sine wave, and a sawtooth wave. The three sliders below the pitch slider set the share of each of these waves. So far so good, but where is the sine wave slider? Well, the sine wave slider substitutes the triangle wave slider when I choose the sine wave in the menu of the algorithm. Let me play around with different shares of each wave a bit. This third wave shape, slider 4, can be even a square wave, additionally to the pulse wave of slider 3. I reach this adjustment in the right-click menu, where I can also enable a sub-oscillator function and disable hard sync. Alright, let's talk about some details now. The middle position of the three wave-shape sliders is their zero position. With all three of them being at their middle position, the VST doesn't deliver any sound at all. Moving the sawtooth slider to the right creates an up ramp. Moving it to the left creates a down ramp. Moving the pulse slider to the right creates a clean pulse wave with a duty cycle of 50% when the width slider is in middle position. Moving the pulse slider to the left creates the same pulse wave, but with a phase shift of 180 degrees, a half wave. We see it in the oscillator window, but there is no difference sound-wise when we work with only a single oscillator. But when the third wave-shape slider is adjusted to pulse wave and its slider position is opposite to the slider position of the second wave-shape slider, then the two phase-shifted waves cancel each out, and there is no sound at all. But there is even another function in this third wave-shape slider, slider 4 in the row of all sliders. It can serve as a sub-oscillator. I activate this function in the right-click menu of the slider. It's important to know that the sub-oscillator does not participate in unison. It's always only one voice. That's an important difference to the classic algorithm I explained at the beginning. There, with the classic algorithm, the sub-oscillator does participate in unison. To make it absolutely clear, this sub-oscillator can produce all three wave shapes: triangle, sine, and square. In the classic algorithm from before, the sub-oscillator produced only a pulse wave. In the modern algorithm, there is an internal reference oscillator. We don't hear this oscillator, we cannot influence this oscillator, there's no slider for this oscillator, so what is it good for? Well, it serves as the reference oscillator the three wave shapes are hard-synced against when I add hard sync to the sound by moving the sync slider to the right. So, sawtooth, pulse, and square are hard-synced against the invisible internal reference oscillator. But when the third wave shape slider function is switched to sub-oscillator, I can choose whether or not this sub-oscillator shall bypass hard syncing. Alright, the width slider now. This slider sets the duty cycle of the pulse shape of the second wave shape slider, the pulse slider. It does not influence the third wave shape slider, not in regular mode nor in sub-oscillator mode. We have already seen the sync slider, the hard sync function in action, and so no further words are needed. But let me draw your attention to some functions in the right-click menu I have not mentioned yet. Some parameters offer extended ranges, for example the pitch parameter. Or even the unison detune parameter. Let me extend the range of unison detune, push the slider to maximum and choose only 2 unison voices. I get a nice organ sound this way. The unison detune parameter can be set in cents, which is the setting by default, or in hertz. This is the setting when I switch to absolute in the right-click menu. I've made up my mind. I won't make a monster tutorial of about 2 hours length or even more about the oscillator section, but rather a couple of smaller, shorter modules. It will be more comfortable for you, I think. So don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next part, and enjoy your day. Rolf.